All right. Welcome to the fourth course in the John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. So far, we have gone through transformations of consciousness through time, in which we studied philosophers of the evolution of consciousness, such as Sri Aurobindo, Rudolf Steiner, Teilhard de Chardin, individuals like that. And then we moved on to understanding mythology, and we went through the great sort of architects of mythological comparative mythology, such as Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and individuals like that. And then we have just completed the history of German idealist philosophy, which I regard as a necessary prerequisite for truly and fully understanding Nietzsche's ideas. And so now we're going to go through Friedrich Nietzsche and 7 of his best books. Let's take a look at them here. These will be The Birth of Tragedy, which remains my favorite, although later on he sort of disowned the book. But when you read synopses of the career of Nietzsche, very often the writer will tend to group it into periods, normally 3, sometimes 4 distinct epochs of his thought. I mean, you can do that, but the fact of the matter is that the ideas are all connected together. They are not as disconnected as they seem. The concept in The Birth of Tragedy of the Dionysian principle and the Socratic man, those are all connected to later ideas such as the Superman and in Beyond Good and Evil, the 2 different systems of values, the master morality and slave morality. The second book we'll look at is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Notice that with this book, with the first book, which was published in 1872, Nietzsche was about roughly, I think, 28 years of age. And he had been invited to teach at the University of Basel at the age of 25 years old, without even having gotten a doctoral degree at that point, just on the recommendation of his teacher, Ritschl. On that recommendation alone, they simply handed him the doctorate. Those days are gone. He was very young, and so after he'd been teaching there roughly 4 years, then he published The Birth of Tragedy, which got him into trouble with his colleagues because Nietzsche was, even though he was teaching philosophy, he was also a philologist, a classical philologist, and his colleagues, such as Erwin Roda, who wrote a very good book called Psyche, Rhoda stuck with him for a while, but eventually he was ostracized. The book was made fun of. He was laughed at. It wasn't taken seriously. And after a few more years, I think roughly around the age of 35, he decided once and for all to leave University of Basel. So in the first book, the heroes are the Greeks. And then in this later book, he's written like 4 or 5 books in between them. He switches to the Persians, interestingly enough. The enemies, the mortal enemies of the Greeks, where his central figure is Zarathustra, and he brings Zarathustra back because Zarathustra was the one who inaugurated the religion of Zoroastrianism about the year 1000 BC, which is the date that I favor, not the 500 BC. I think that's too late. The Gathas have simply too many, are the sacred texts that Zarathustra wrote. There's simply too many similarities to the language of the Rig Veda for those 2 peoples to have been long separated. So 1000 BC is much more likely. But Zarathustra is the first to take cosmic dualism, a religion based upon the absolute opposition of good, identified with light, and the absolute opposition of evil, identified with darkness, and turn it into a religion. And so Nietzsche brings Zarathustra back here. Here he is at the top of a mountain. The text begins with him coming out of a cave at the top of a mountain to go down to the flatland of the village world to teach a new philosophy, this time one that will transcend this, what Nietzsche regarded as an outmoded opposition between absolute good and absolute evil. And so hence it will go, the new teaching will go beyond good and evil. Whereas Zarathustra is written in parables, it sort of vaguely resembles one of the Gospels. Beyond Good and Evil has basically the same ideas in it, but rendered in his classic aphoristic style. And then he follows that with On the Genealogy of Morals. I think these are his four best and most important books: The Birth of Tragedy, Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and Genealogy of Morals. And then these two short works that are very often published together, Twilight of the Idols and The Antichrist. The Antichrist is subtitled How to Philosophize with a Hammer, which I love. These are sort of, in a way, leftovers, or at least very slimmed down remainders of a much larger work that he had been working on called The Will to Power, an attempt at a transvaluation of all values. And that text, he never finished it, and it's kind of messy. I haven't included it in the course because it reads like a notebook. It's kind of messy, and it doesn't have the usual elegance and concision that is associated with Nietzsche, who's very clean, clear, and readable, whereas Will to Power is not. It's clearly an abortive project. So these are sort of what the Will to Power wound up being. These two short texts, they're absolutely wonderful, and two of his best books. And in this later period in the 1880s, when he was writing, by 1888, he wrote an autobiography called Ecce Homo, How One Becomes What One Is. Notice how Nietzsche very often puts on different masks. This mask is the crown of thorns. Ecce Homo is what Pilate says when he introduces Christ to the masses with a crown of thorns, and he's all ready to be crucified. So I find that interesting that he sort of puts on the mask of Christ here. He's been battling Christianity for his entire life, or his entire career. And here he's starting to identify, as he verges into madness near the end of his career, he's starting to identify with mythological archetypes, such as Dionysus. He's signing letters to his friends, Dionysus, or the Crucified One. And these last three books were published posthumously. And he went catatonic roughly in 1889. There were large signs of mental illness leading up to that, in the few years leading up to it. And then he was catatonic for about the last 10 years of his life, and he died in 1900. Okay, so I want to go over in this first class just some of the main ideas, because, as I say, they're all connected, and it's when you read Nietzsche for the first time, it's not always easy to see just how the ideas are connected. So he begins with the birth of tragedy and this opposition between the Apollonian principle and the Dionysian principle. These are terms, I believe, that he has taken from his colleague, J.J. Bachofen, who also taught at the University of Basel, but was not a friend of Nietzsche's, although Jakob Burckhardt was. They were friends. But he's taken these terms from Bachofen, the guy who founded the idea of mother right, in his book Mother Right, that was put out around 1860, and in which he articulates this idea that there was an older matriarchal substratum beneath the Greek world, the Olympian, the world of the Homeric gods, the Olympians. So Nietzsche sort of borrows these terms, but they don't have the same meanings, the same meanings that Bachofen assigned to them. Instead, what he's actually done, because he has discovered Schopenhauer very early on, he was in his early 20s, this was, I believe, 1865, and he discovers Schopenhauer, which hit him like an atom bomb. It was just an enormous explosion, and then suddenly, after reading Schopenhauer, he decided he wanted to be a philosopher. He was going to move into philosophy. And he has taken Schopenhauer's idea of the world as will and representation, where Schopenhauer creates this dichotomy between the world as representation, as the world of the phenomenal world that is apparent to our five senses, and the understanding, which comes equipped a priori with the forms of space-time and causality in the human brain, which makes sense out of the external world and turns it into a realm of representations, phenomenal representations. And behind that, though, is what Schopenhauer calls the world as will, this cosmic will, which is an idea now that Schopenhauer has taken from Schelling. Schelling had assigned to God, to the absolute originally. After Hegel stole the term absolute from him for the phenomenology, Schelling, while he was writing Ages of the World, which was his unpublished magnum opus, uses the word God instead of the absolute, and he ascribes three potencies or powers to the absolute. And it's the first potency of this dark that God posits himself. In a way, the first and only surviving book of Ages of the World, which was originally going to be a trilogy, in the first book, it's sort of a prequel to the book of Genesis. Before God creates the world, first we have to see how God posits himself. In other words, how God sort of autonomously creates himself from out of his own essence. And he comes out of this fundamental ground of being, this abyss, this dark ground of will and volition that brings him into being. And the second potency is the power of love, and also rationality and reason that restrains these dark, deep impulses of the God being. And and so the other thing with Schopenhauer, so he's taken the will concept from Schelling, but this opposition of will and representation has come from Immanuel Kant, where in Immanuel Kant it is the opposition between the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm. Noumenal means not phenomenal, which is the realm of the Ding an sich, the realm of things in and of themselves, as they are independently of human perception. According to Kant, we bring with us space, time, and the various categories of the understanding, quantity, quality, relation, and modality. We bring with us to experience to make sense out of experience these basic a priori forms, although they're empty until they're filled in by sense phenomena, by sensibility. But behind all of that is this realm of things in themselves, how they would be if we could get at them without the apparatus and the limitations of the human brain. So total objectivity is forever beyond our grasp for Kant. There is objectivity only within the realm of the sciences and in the realm of space-time and the categories. And so what Schopenhauer does is he shaves off all the categories except for causality, and he retains space-time and causality as a priori forms of the understanding. He says even animals have the understanding. They have a causal principle in their brains by way of which they make sense out of the external phenomenal world that they have to. They have to be able to find mates and food. So the causal principle is there in animals as well. But it creates a world of representations. And then what Schopenhauer does is to plug into that semiotic vacancy of Kant's thing in itself, this cosmic will to exist that he has taken from Schelling, without credit, by the way, that there's this cosmic will that animates the world, that has brought everything into being. It's totally, fundamentally irrational, selfish, and absolutely one. It's a single, unified idea. And he compares it with the dichotomy that is set up in the Upanishads. Schopenhauer was basically the first to start to integrate Indian thought into Western philosophy with this idea of Brahman, which is the ultimate ground of being, which would correspond to Hegel's and Schelling's absolute, to Kant's thing in itself, and to Schopenhauer's will. And Maya, then, the realm of illusion, the realm of space and time that covers Brahman, this fundamental ground of unity, would correspond then to representation and to Kant's phenomenal realm of space-time, causality, and the categories. All right, so Nietzsche inherits all of this through his reading of Schopenhauer, and then when he writes The Birth of Tragedy, he's already met Wagner by this point in 1869, just a few years after discovering Schopenhauer. Wagner, too, had discovered Schopenhauer in the middle of writing the Ring Cycle in the 1850s. He was writing Siegfried, and he had stopped. He had written the first act of Siegfried, and he had stopped, and then had the good fortune to discover and read Schopenhauer. And for Schopenhauer, music is the greatest of all the arts. It was Schopenhauer's favorite, and it's the one art form, according to Schopenhauer, that is the actual objectification of the will. It objectifies the will. And it's the greatest of all the arts because it's fundamentally emotional, and it gets right inside the human being and taps deep down into the will that motivates all of us. And so Nietzsche has read all of this and inherited it, and he transforms it into the Dionysian. So the Dionysian principle is homologous, let's say, with Schopenhauer's will and the thing in itself and Brahman, the Dionysian principle, whereas the Apollonian then corresponds to representation, the phenomenal world, the world of space, time, and causality. So the Apollonian is the principle of individuation, the realm where things are separate from each other. This is the realm of individuality, the realm of separate forms that are subject to space-time and causality. Whereas the Dionysian has to do with boundary dissolution. It has to do, Dionysus is the god of wine, drinking, boundary dissolution, and this fundamental sense of unity. But it takes on connotations for Nietzsche of cruelty, pessimism. In a way, he's trying to turn upside down Winckelmann's idea in the 18th century of his description of the Greeks as a civilization of noble simplicity and calm grandeur. Well, that's only the surface of the Greek world. That's only the Apollonian world. It absolutely does not include the Dionysian. So the Dionysian, for Nietzsche, it takes on connotations of darkness, cruelty, the tearing apart of animals and the rights of the Bacchants, and the disintegration of boundaries, and so forth. And it's opposed to the Apollonian. So in tragedy, then, he takes these two principles and he says that with Greek tragedy, when it was at its apogee with Aeschylus and Sophocles, these two principles were perfectly in balance. The irrationalism of the Dionysian principle and the rationalism of the Apollonian. You can think of the Apollonian as a sort of column, as a Greek column or a Greek temple. But these darker rites that came out of the worship of Dionysus, the tragedy comes out of the worship of Dionysus, presupposes that there were ancient things like human sacrifice and the tearing apart of animals that is behind all of this. And it is also for Nietzsche the Greek perception of the world as a realm of suffering and a pessimistic insight into the world, just like Schopenhauer's insight into the realm of the world as will, which is fundamentally pessimistic, and to which Schopenhauer says an absolute no. For Schopenhauer, the only release that we have from servitude to the will is aesthetic arrest, what James Joyce calls aesthetic arrest, which is the beholding of art with disinterested pleasure, to use Kant's term for aesthetics, because it's not in servitude to the will. So it's disinterested pleasure, the aesthetic arrest, or asceticism. That's the other release. But either way, asceticism, especially for Nietzsche, is a saying of no to the world, whereas Nietzsche wants to say yes. And so the Dionysian actually, he often goes back and transvalues his own values. Later on in his career, he'll go back to the Dionysian, only it'll take on connotations of optimism and joy and abundance and creativity and strength. So he reverses the original meanings of the word having to do with pessimism and the insight into the dark abyss. So the insight into the dark abyss for Nietzsche, he says that for the Greeks, their insight into that abyss was only justified by the creation of art. Life can only be justified for Nietzsche as an aesthetic phenomenon. And he says that's what the Greeks did. Instead of doing the Schopenhauerian ascetic no, with a glance into the abyss of the world and its evils and suffering, the Greeks said yes to it, and they did so by transfiguring it through the creation of great art, such as Greek tragedy. And so Nietzsche is saying that with Aeschylus and Sophocles, we have these two principles in perfect balance. The chorus represents the ground of being, the Dionysian, the will, the group, the communal, from out of which tragedy emerged, we know, by a separate individual setting himself apart from the group, the chorus, and then another individual joins him in a dialogue, and then pretty soon we have the principle of individuation. We've got two characters on stage in dialogue with each other. That's the Apollonian. The Dionysian is the chorus, the ground of being, and the Apollonian is the tragic protagonists whose sufferings on stage we watch. And so he says these principles are perfectly balanced with Aeschylus and Sophocles, but it was destroyed with Socrates. When Socrates comes on stage, and he was a close friend of Euripides, with Euripides, Greek tragedy starts to die under the influence of Socratic rationalism. Socrates, as he says later in, I think it's Twilight of the Idols, Socrates was the buffoon who got listened to. People actually took this guy seriously with his idea of sterilizing the mysteries by rationalizing them out of existence. Socrates begins to bring in the principle of nihilism with his rationalism that sterilizes and destroys culture, it destroys the arts, and it destroys any kind of understanding of this dark, deeper Dionysian world. So that by the time you get to the plays of Euripides, the Apollonian principle has taken over almost completely. The principle of rationalism has taken over almost completely, and the chorus gradually dies out with Euripides. It ceases to retain its function, and so it disappears, and then you get a decline. And that's just in that art form, but the entire culture for Nietzsche was in decline with the rise of the Socratic man and then the gradual spread of reason. Not too long after that, we're on the threshold of the Hellenistic world, after the death of Alexander around 323 BC, who was a pupil of Aristotle, and with the Hellenistic world, we get the rise of the sciences, the Greek sciences, which begin to lose touch with mythology, with a proper understanding of the myths and the mysteries. All that begins to fade out. So you can see here that with The Birth of Tragedy, this book, for those of you who are familiar with the philosopher of history Oswald Spengler, you can see the influence of Nietzsche on Spengler quite profoundly with this book. Spengler takes over the idea of the Socratic man and says that the Socratic man doesn't just come on stage in the Greek world. The Socratic man can be found in all of the great high civilizations, and Spengler identified 9 of them, at the point where each civilization is at its apogee and is finishing up with its primary worldview, and nihilism then begins to appear on stage with the pharaoh Akhenaten in Egypt, who outlaws and anathematizes all the funerary deities, in other words, the Dionysian realm of death and so forth, for only an Apollonian religion of the sun. Nietzsche doesn't mention this. This is my insight, which can be found in my book, Rage in the Word, on the pharaoh Akhenaten. The Buddha, for Spengler, represents this same sterilizing nihilistic principle. The Buddha says no to the world, and it says no to the soul. The Atman does not exist. The Brahman does not exist. The gods do not exist. Nothing exists. Hence nirvana, which means to blow out, as in blowing out a candle flame. You're blowing out the world. So the world becomes this empty void that in Mahayana Buddhism will be called shunyata, which is a whole different matter with Mahayana Buddhism, which brings the gods back eventually with what Spengler calls India's second religiousness. But this type of thinking, and then in the West he says this appears with Voltaire, it appears during the Enlightenment with the almightiness of reason, with Voltaire and Rousseau and Hume and all of these kinds of thinkers who bring in the almightiness of reason and begin to lose touch with the Dionysian depths, the mysteries, the darkness, the tragic pathos. All of that is sterilized by the man of mere reason and rationality. And then so with Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche makes a fundamental distinction between, which he writes around the age of 40, shortly after he has left the university for good and has become a kind of lonely wanderer, leading a very peripatetic lifestyle. He makes a distinction between 2 different types of morality, which is absolutely fundamental to understand because it's 100% relevant to what is going on today, especially in today's American politics. Where he says that there is slave morality, this is the morality of Christianity, and there is master morality, which is the morality of the Greeks, especially the Greeks of Homer's epics, the Iliad in particular. But it is so for master morality, we have the morality of the nobleman who makes a distinction between good and bad. He is good who can repay a slight with an equal slight. So the Trojans are not evil. They're not even bad. They're respected. And so the enemy is even respected. They're regarded as being both on the same plane. Bad is he who has no power to avenge an insult, to avenge a slap in the face with a slap back. It's merely bad. So that distinction is between not good and evil, but good and bad. Whereas Christianity brings in the distinction with slave morality, which could also be called herd morality, the distinction between good and evil. He is good who is not a threat to us. He is good who can benefit us as a community, as a group, who is not a threat to us or our way of life or our morality. He is evil, however, who has the power to harm us. So in other words, the kind of individual that is vaunted and praised in master morality is precisely the type of individual that is condemned by slave morality, herd morality. Herd morality is based on resentment of those who have power, resentment of those supermen, those creative individuals who create systems of values, works of art, literature, who think dangerous thoughts. Those individuals are evil. They can harm us. They're powerful. So anyone who is regarded as a kind of, and this is, of course, Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, which does not mean some sort of Nazi, Aryan, eugenic process. That's not what it means. The Superman is one who is a powerful individual whose morality indicates an ascent of culture upward toward the heights of great creativity. Spengler characterizes this as the hawk's perspective versus the frog's perspective. The hawk flies and looks down at its prey. The frog crawls and looks up for the predator. And so slave morality or herd morality wants to bring everyone down to the same plane and to praise mediocrity, to elevate mediocrity. And that's essentially what we've got right now with the rise of the woke left. They have come out of this tradition of Christian slave morality, whereas the right has retained somewhat of this master morality. Although Nietzsche says it's not a simple black and white thing, because these principles are always mixed in cultures, and they can even be mixed in single individuals, as I think he saw in himself. So these are all philosophies for Nietzsche of strength, power. Nietzsche's constantly testing himself. He's putting on new masks, new guises, testing himself, testing out new points of view to see what will happen. He's constantly stressing himself, in other words, to see what he can achieve. How far can this go? And so figures who come on stage, who transvalue values, create new things. And so this is so all of this is interrelated to, you can see the continuity of thinking from the birth of tragedy through Beyond Good and Evil and on into Genealogy of Morals, which introduces the concept of resentment. And the woke left is most certainly motivated by resentment against anyone who has power. Trump represents this kind of master morality principle, and the woke left going after him is a classic working out of this the struggle or agon between these two different types of morality. Now, with respect to Christian morality, Nietzsche says that Christian morality is winding down and will eventually lead to nihilism because God is dead. So he announces in The Gay Science that God is dead, meaning that the entire Christian religion is no longer effective. Belief in God has gone. We have already seen that Schopenhauer was the first philosopher of the German idealists not to believe in God, and Nietzsche liked him for precisely that reason. Nietzsche was realizing that Christianity wasn't working anymore. He certainly didn't believe in God anymore. He becomes an atheist fundamentally and essentially. But you can still have Christianity lingering in the forms of these kinds of secular versions of Christianity that retain, you lose the God idea as a transcendental signified, as Derrida would call it. You lose the God idea, but you retain the morality, the slave morality, through secularized versions of Christianity, such as, for Nietzsche, democracy, but also, and more importantly, socialism. Socialism is a form of nihilism, and it eventually does lead to nihilism. So that Nietzsche says Christianity, it can keep things going in these secular versions of itself for a while, but eventually it's going to run out of gas, and it's going to lead to complete and total nihilism. And there are two forms of nihilism, passive nihilism and active nihilism. Passive nihilism for him is simply an acquiescence, a recognition of these dead values that no longer are culture building anymore, and there's just simply an acquiescence. But with active nihilism, you get the kind of thing that you got with the Nazis, where they go in and they actively destroy the Christian value system, the Christian religion, Christian signifiers. And in that semiotic vacancy now that has been left behind by Christianity, they try to plug in Scandinavian mythology. just as Wagner was doing. Wagner was also trying to create a religion based on Scandinavian mythology, which Nietzsche liked at first, but part of his disillusionment with Wagner was realizing that this guy's an egomaniac and he's creating this religion, this art form that he thinks is a religion, but Nietzsche knows is not. It's just it's a form of art. So those two parted ways over Nietzsche writing Human, All Too Human, and Wagner writing his last opera, Parsifal, which Nietzsche felt was just full of Christian sanctimoniousness. And it's a dead religion anyway. You're not going to get anything new out of Christianity. It's lost its culture-creating power for Nietzsche. So he walks away from it. So it eventually will lead to nihilism. So we have these two forms of nihilism. With active nihilism, you also have, at the opposite political extreme with the woke left, a form of active nihilism with cancel culture, the destruction of statues, canceling of individuals' careers that they simply disagree with. Anyone who disagrees with the woke left gets canceled. That's active nihilism. So that nihilism is a kind of cultural autoimmune disorder. For Nietzsche, the various moralities that civilizations create act as sort of immune systems for those societies. They protect societies. They protect individuals. Peter Sloterdijk, riffing off of Nietzsche, who's a contemporary German theoretician, will later say that metaphysics is applied immunology. But I think with Nietzsche, we could say that morality for him was a form of applied immunology because it protects societies and individuals with their illusions. For him, these moral systems are fundamentally lies. They're illusions and self-deceptions. But they work for a while anyway, as long as they do work, they work to prevent chaos and anarchy. And they are culture creating. They bring culture and civilization into being. And for Nietzsche, culture was the absolute, the greatest thing. And he recognized that the West was in a decadent mode with the death of Christianity and the inevitable death of Christian values, which will lead to nihilism, since not because there are no other possible value systems, there are. It's simply for the West. The West thinks there are no other value systems than Christianity. So we need to get beyond good and evil. We need to get beyond the legacy left to us by the Zoroastrian religion, left to us by Zarathustra himself, by bringing him back on stage, in Nietzsche's book, of course, by bringing him back on stage to announce new values that will take us beyond the worn-out system of values represented by Christianity with its absolute opposition between good and evil, between master morality and slave morality, two different moral systems. All right, so we'll stop there for this preview of what we're going to look at in the next 7 classes after this. That's a sort of bird's eye overview of Nietzsche's main ideas. And once again, I want to reiterate here that, in conclusion, you can see how all these ideas are connected together. Nietzsche isn't a philosopher with random thoughts. At first glance, one who sits down and reads his books might suspect that. Or that the Nietzsche of the Birth of Tragedy, which he later denounces, wrongly, I think, because I think it's his best book, actually, the Nietzsche of the Birth of Tragedy is totally different from the Nietzsche of the Genealogy of Morals. They're not. It's the same basic set of ideas that has to do with cultural disintegration, how and why cultures disintegrate. And in that respect, you can see Nietzsche's influence on Spengler is tremendous. Nietzsche really is the first diagnostician, the first physician of cultural illness, you might say. And so with Nietzsche's philosophy, I think we can start to see philosophy starting to shade off now into cultural criticism. Nietzsche was both a philosopher and a cultural critic, as was Oswald Spengler. But Spengler retains Nietzsche's cultural criticism, but also Goethe's idealist philosophy. So he sort of combines both of them, as he says in the preface to The Decline of the West, that he got from Goethe the method, especially from the metamorphosis of plants, and from Nietzsche the critical stance, the questioning of whether these particular values of this or that phase of the West or this or that phenomenon in the West is healthy or ill. Does it render this particular set of values, whatever it happens to be, does it render one fit for life? do these, and for Nietzsche, this is the fitness of a truth system, is does it render a people or an individual fit for life? That you're up to the task of living a healthy life and accomplishing great deeds? Or is it, as with, I think he would say of Schopenhauer when he was disillusioned with him and turned against Schopenhauer's no to the world, or does it render one unfit? Schopenhauer's philosophy perhaps renders one unfit for the world because it's not up to the task of living your life. All right, so that's my overview of Nietzsche's basic ideas, and I look forward to discussing these with you in class.